If you were born somewhere between April 1970 and April 1977, there's a good chance your retirement spreadsheet has a start date sitting in one of its cells. A single day when the state pension is supposed to begin. Right now, that date is being quietly reconsidered inside the Treasury, and most people in that age band have no idea it's happening. A new report from the Office for Budget Responsibility, published this month, points to state pension age 68 landing somewhere between 2037 and 2039. The law currently on the books says 2044 to 2046. That's a gap of up to 7 years, and for someone who has built a plan around a specific year, 7 years is not a rounding error. It's £12,547.60 a year in state pension income that might arrive later than expected, or in some cases, earlier than the current law technically allows. When will I get my state pension is the question most people type into a search bar, expecting a fixed answer the way a birthday is fixed. This month, the honest answer depends on a report that just landed and a review that hasn't finished, which is a strange thing to build a retirement date around. This isn't political noise you can safely ignore until it becomes official. It's a specific piece of legislative machinery, one that has a known trigger point, and once you understand how that machinery works, you can stop guessing and start planning around the actual mechanism instead of the headline. We need to look at what that July 2026 report actually says, because it names a specific window, 2037 to 2039, and that window alone could shift your retirement date without you changing a single thing about your own plan. The law right now is clear enough on paper. The Pensions Act 2014 sets the rise to state pension age 68 for the years 2044 to 2046. If you're in your late 50s, that probably felt like someone else's problem, decades away, easy to file under future you. Then the Office for Budget Responsibility published its Fiscal Risks and Sustainability report in July 2026, and it changed the shape of that problem. The report doesn't set policy on its own. It models the numbers the Treasury is actually working from, and those numbers point to age 68 arriving between 2037 and 2039, not 2044 to 2046. State pension spending is growing faster than the economy paying for it, and pulling the age forward is one of the few levers that brings the two back into balance. Here's the scale of the pressure behind that decision. State pension spending is projected to rise from around 5% of GDP today to close to 9% by 2075, driven mainly by an aging population and the triple lock guarantee. That matters to you directly, because a bill growing that fast doesn't stay unfunded. Something has to give, and the age at which the payments start is one of the few dials the Treasury can actually turn. None of this is theoretical for people already living through it. The rise from 66 to 67 is happening now, phased in between April 2026 and April 2028. If you're in that age band, you're not reading about a future policy. You're inside one already, and the 68 decision is being modelled around people exactly like you. I don't have a crystal ball, and neither does the Treasury. What we do have is the same data they're using to make the decision. And that data says the timeline has moved before and can move again. The OBR is naming a window 7 years earlier than the law currently allows, but the Treasury has given a very specific response to that pressure. It's worth asking whether that response actually protects your date or just delays the conversation. When journalists asked the Treasury directly whether age 68 was moving to 2037, the answer wasn't a flat denial. It wasn't a confirmation either. The Treasury said the government has no current plans to change the legislated timetable, and that the third state pension age review will weigh all the relevant evidence, including life expectancy and fiscal sustainability, before anything changes. That sentence does a lot of work, so it's worth slowing down on it. By law, every parliament has to run a state pension age review. This is the third one. It isn't a political favour or a one-off reaction to a bad headline. It's a built-in check that happens whether the news cycle is calm or not. Inside that review sits something I think of as a triangle. One corner is the independent report itself, written by people outside government. Another corner is data from the government actuary, the office that actually works through life expectancy and cost projections. The third corner is political will, and that's the part nobody can model in advance because it depends on which government is in office when the review lands. So the Treasury's answer wasn't evasive, it was accurate. Nothing is confirmed until all three corners of that triangle line up, and right now only two of them have spoken. The independent report has landed, the government actuary's data is already feeding into it, and the political corner is the one still waiting on a decision. There's one part of this process that isn't up for debate, though, and it tells you almost exactly when speculation turns into a real decision. It's an unwritten rule that has shaped every major change to state pension age since the 1990s, and it's called the 10-year Notice Convention. The government has, in practice, accepted that people need about 10 years' notice before their state pension age actually changes. It isn't written into a single piece of legislation as a hard rule, but it has shaped every major decision on this since the 1990s, because the last time it was ignored, it went badly. The 1995 Pensions Act equalized the state pension age for women, moving many women's retirement date years later than they had planned. For a lot of those women, the notice given was thin, sometimes just a few years, and for some, barely enough time to change a single financial decision. The backlash became a national campaign, Women Against State Pension Inequality, still known today as WASPI, and it's still being discussed in Parliament decades later. No Chancellor wants to relive that, which is exactly why the 10-year convention exists in the first place, even without a law forcing it. That history is exactly why the 10-year convention now sits behind almost every decision on this. If the government genuinely wants state pension age 68 to begin in 2037, the convention means they need to confirm that decision by 2027, not quietly let it drift until 2035 and hope people adjust in time. There's also a counter-argument working in your favour, and it's worth knowing. Life expectancy improvements have slowed compared to the projections used back in 2014, when the current law was written. The Office for National Statistics has been tracking this for a few years now. Slower gains in life expectancy is one of the strongest arguments against rushing the age forward, because the original case for 68 assumed people would keep gaining years of life at a faster rate than they actually have. None of this is only a problem for people in their 50s, who still have time to plan around it. If you're 64 today, you're not reading about a future policy. You're already living through a version of it, and most people at that age are getting the math wrong. Take David. He's a fairly typical case. Born in October 1960, he always assumed his state pension would start at 66, because that's the number he had heard for years. It's not quite right anymore, and it isn't his fault for missing the update. Because of the phased rise that began in April 2026, David's actual start age works out to 66 and 7 months. Not a dramatic jump, but enough to matter if his retirement date was already set to the month. The rule that catches people like David is simple once you see it laid out. If you were born between the 6th of April 1960 and the 5th of March 1961, your state pension age sits somewhere between 66 and 67, depending on your exact birth date. If you were born on or after the 6th of March 1961, it's a flat 67. This isn't a cliff edge, where everyone born on one date gets 66 and everyone born the next day gets 67. It's a slow month-by-month phase-in, which is exactly why so many people miss it. There's no single headline date to remember, just a sliding scale tied to your own birthday, and a birthday nobody thinks to double-check against a government timetable. I've watched people build an entire retirement plan around a number they memorized years ago without realizing the number had quietly moved underneath them. It's an easy mistake, and a common one. It isn't a sign of carelessness. It's just how a slow, month-by-month change slips past people who are busy living their lives. If you're navigating this 66 to 67 transition right now, this is exactly the kind of legislative shift we track on this channel. So subscribe to Arthur's UK Retirement Guide if you want to know when your own finish line moves before it catches you off guard. If the date does move again, what's the actual damage to your finances? Most people assume it wrecks the whole plan. The math says something calmer than that. Let's put an actual number on this, because vague worry is worse than a known cost. Say your plan assumed state pension starting at 67, and the rules shift so it actually starts a year later. What does that year cost? The full new state pension for the 2026 to 2027 tax year is £12,547.60 a year. That's the income you don't receive during that extra year. There's a second part people usually miss, though. You still have bills during that year, so you're likely pulling roughly that same amount, £12,547.60, out of your own ISA or private pension to cover the gap. It lands as a double hit inside the same 12 months. You lose income on one side and draw down capital on the other, and the two numbers are nearly identical. Call it the bridge year. One extra year of self-funding at a cost close to £12,547.60 in capital you would rather have left invested. Picture it as a full year of council tax, energy bills, and the car insurance renewal all landing at once, except it's not one bill, it's an entire year of ordinary living costs, with no state pension underneath them. I used to tell people to plan around the legislated date, because that is what the law said. I was wrong to leave it there. In this fiscal climate, the safer habit is planning for the earliest date, realistically on the table, not the latest one the current law allows. It costs nothing to be a year early with your buffer. It costs £12,547.60 to be a year late. Two paths sit in front of anyone reading the numbers this way. One path assumes the state pension arrives exactly when today's law says, and gets caught short if the date moves, scrambling to find £12,547.60 at short notice. The other path builds a small buffer now, a bridge year fund sitting inside an ISA or pension, so that if the date does move, it becomes an inconvenience instead of a crisis, and the money is already sitting there waiting. Building that buffer is the easy part to say. The harder part is doing it while the government is also changing the rules on ISAs in the middle of all this, on a timeline that doesn't wait for anyone's retirement date to catch up. Two things are worth doing this month, and neither takes long. First, check your state pension forecast directly on gov.uk. It is a 5-minute job, and the forecast now reflects the 67 rise, so you will see your actual projected date rather than the number you have been carrying around in your head for years. Second, start what I would call the bridge year ISA strategy. The ISA allowance for the 2026 to 2027 tax year is £20,000, and right now all of that can still go into a cash ISA if you are under 65. That changes from April 2027, when the cash ISA limit for under 65s drops to £12,000 a year. The overall £20,000 allowance stays the same, but a smaller share of it can sit in cash specifically, and the rest has to go into stocks and shares if you want to use the full amount. This isn't a reason to panic about your existing savings, it's a reason to think about timing. Money that's already sitting in a cash ISA from previous years isn't affected by the 2027 change. It's only new money going in from that point onward that runs into the lower cash limit. That gives you a real dated window. Between now and the 6th of April 2027, you have the ability to build a larger cash cushion inside an ISA than you will be able to build afterward. If a bridge year fund is something you want sitting in cash rather than invested, this tax year and next are the years to build it, before that door narrows. There is one more thing standing between people and actually doing this, and it is not the maths. It is a very specific, very human habit of avoiding the whole subject. There is a name for what happens next in a lot of people's heads, and it is called information avoidance. If checking your forecast might reveal bad news, the pension date moving later, the easiest thing to do is stop checking. It is not laziness, It is a completely normal response to feeling like the ground is shifting under a plan you worked hard to build. It is exhausting to feel like the goalposts keep moving, especially after decades of paying in and doing everything the way you were told. It can feel like a promise being broken, even though no individual person broke it. That reaction is fair, and it is worth sitting with rather than rushing past it to get to the solution. There is a gentler way to hold it, though. Don't frame this as working longer. Frame it as funding a gap you can already see coming, because you can see it now, this year, not in a panic later. One extra year of state pension works out to around 63% of your entire ISA allowance for a year. That is a real number, but it is a solvable one, not an open-ended threat. Here is where this actually lands. The law on the book says state pension age 68 in 2044. The OBR's own modelling says 2037. The 10-year notice convention says we will have a real answer, one way or the other, by 2027. 3 numbers, 3 sources, and none of them agree yet, which is exactly why it's worth watching rather than guessing. You now have the actual numbers instead of a vague worry. A £12,547.60 gap, if it happens, is a hurdle you can plan around. It is not a wall. The people who come out of this comfortably won't be the ones who worked longer out of fear. They'll be the ones who built a small buffer early, while the rules were still generous enough to make it easy. Subscribe if you want to know what the 2027 State Pension Age Review actually decides, because when it lands, the date in your own spreadsheet might need updating, and I would rather you hear it here first than find out by accident.